Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. My name is Jen Skalitsky and I am your moderator today, and thanks so much for all of you for taking time out of your busy day. I know some of you are off, but you're in for a good webinar today. Gail Bowser, who has been so wonderful and helped us create the updated ISB manual. She is the author. And then we also have from the Illinois State Board of Education, Amy Deegan, who has been wonderful technical support for us as well throughout this process. So both of them are presenting today.
So welcome everybody to the second webinar in our series of 3 about the new frequently asked questions document that we developed in order to provide some additional specific information and answer new questions that have come up since the issuance of the Illinois AT Guidance Manual last year. My name's Gail Bowser, and by now, if you've been attending some of these webinars, you're pretty familiar with me and my voice, but I want to introduce you to my co-presenter today, Amy Deegan. Amy, you want to introduce yourself and say hello?
Sure. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Amy Deegan. I'm a principal consultant in the special education department at ISB, and my position specifically focuses on low incidence populations, the educational surrogate parent program, and coordinator for some of our grants, including our assistive technology grants. So I'm excited to be here, and so far I'm having a lot of fun collaborating with Infinitec and Gail. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. And we've had a lot of fun collaborating with you on this project. One of the things that's kind of a geeky thing that I enjoy doing is really investigating some of the nuances of assistive technology and the requirements in IDEA, and also how high quality assistive technology services might look for your state. So we began this journey with the development of a second edition of the Illinois Assistive Technology Guidance Manual. The first one was issued in 2012. And it came from a different group of people, but in 2018, Brian Wojcik was contracted with Infinitec to help develop a second edition of the manual. And when Brian moved to a different state to take a position at the university, Infinitec contacted me and said, would I become the author on this manual and finish up some of the work? So that's how I got involved. I should probably tell you I'm coming to you as an independent consultant from Oregon. The guidance manual table of contents looks like this, and it is about a 100-page document. It has a great deal of helpful guidance and also descriptions of what high-quality assistive technology services might look like. So one thing that you won't find in every state's guidance manual is some of the chapters, like chapter 7, which talks about understanding AT implementation, chapter 8 that talks about understanding continuous progress monitoring, and chapter 9 that talks about transition. So we're proud that this particular guidance manual has a lot of that kind of detail in it, as well as the procedural and compliance questions that you may often have. If you want to download the Illinois Assistive Technology Guidance Manual directly from the web, you can. This is the URL, but it is provided today as one of your 3 handouts. So you can get it right here and never leave the webinar. In today's webinar, we're going to do several different things. One is we're going to address questions from participants that were submitted during our February Frequently Asked Questions webinar. In that webinar, one of the things that we discovered was that your questions, as you use the guidance manual and as you really investigate what the rules and procedures are for assistive technology in your state, have become very much more detailed and very much more sophisticated. I was kind of proud of the level of questions that we got at the last webinar, because I think it shows your deep thinking about some of the assistive technology questions that we've encountered. So we had a bunch of questions at the last webinar that, as an expert consultant from a different state, I was not totally sure about some of the answers. So we asked Amy to join us today to give us some of those kinds of answers to things that are unique to the state of Illinois, but also just to give us a different perspective on some of the questions that you may have. We're also going to review the second part of the frequently asked questions document that we developed to accompany the guide. And the reason we didn't get through the whole thing last time was because of your deep and intense level of questions. So we believe we can finish up the table of contents list today as we go through the second half of the frequently asked questions document. And then we also want to invite you to submit other questions that you may have. Please, if you have questions, please write them in the questions panel. If we can't address them today, we'll do so during our May 3rd webinar. And one of the things that we discovered last time was that really, because your questions were pretty sophisticated, we needed sometimes to go back and do some checking on some of the answers before we gave them in a webinar format. So if you want to download, yes.
I apologize. This is Amy. If I may, I believe Jen did put a link to a Google document in the chat. So if you have questions, you can also enter them there so that we can make sure we collect them so that we can all look at them at the end of today's webinar.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I'm glad we got that up. If you want to download the Assistive Technology Guidance Manual Frequently Asked Questions document, it looks like this, and there's the URL where you can find it on the ISBE website, but you can also, again, get that from our handouts today. Before we really get started on the questions, there's one other thing that it's important to say about this. The information in both the guidance manual and the frequently asked questions document is provided as support to districts in order to clarify procedural questions and describe effective practices. One of the things I learned when I went to administrators school and got my superintendent certificate was that policies and procedures and documents like this are really designed to answer questions that have good, solid answers. What that does is leave us time to think about things that don't occur frequently and don't have real good, solid answers, and figure out the best ways to do things. So one of the things we wanted to say to you is that if your current practices are established and working well, you shouldn't interpret things that are written into the guidance manual as a need to change them unless you have some indication that they don't provide the child with a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment. If you encounter questions regarding compliance with IDEA or other national and state statutes, you should consult with your district attorney if it rises to that level of concern. But the main thing about any of the guidance about assistive technology is that it needs to provide students with disabilities with FAPE in the least restrictive environment. Another thing that's important to say before we really get into the meat of this is that some of the frequently asked questions we've been receiving really are questions about how you do things in your district. Neither IDEA or ISBE will provide you very, very specific answers to questions like some of the ones that you see listed here. So what are the specific sources of funding for AT devices and services? That's going to vary from district to district. Some districts will have large budget lines that help them purchase assistive technology, while other districts may infuse their budgets for assistive technology into other budget lines. Same thing with questions like, where do you write things on the IEP? how do we manage 504 plans for students who need assistive technology but don't require specially designed instruction? So one of the things that's important to know is that we can't always provide answers to some of these very specific questions. And part of that is because it's so important to allow districts as much flexibility as possible in the way they do things, because districts have different resources, different personnel, different levels of expertise. Here's an example of a question like that. The question is, should the low-tech devices such as calculators be listed on the consideration of special factors? And the answer is that calculators and other low-tech devices are, by federal definition, assistive technology. So they do qualify as assistive technology if you're looking just at the definition. But individual school districts determine how IEP teams should list needed accommodations, list AT devices, and list AT services in IEP documents. And the IEP team should follow the guidance provided from your district. And that is to ensure that there's consistency and equity for all your students. So what we're looking for in district operating guidelines is consistency, so that everybody knows how we do it for any child who needs assistive technology. You can see here at the bottom of this slide a quote from page 34 in the guide, which talks about that same issue in a little bit different way. It talks about classroom technology and whether or not a technology tool that the IEP team has identified as AT for a student has to be written in the IEP. So again, if a student needs to use a particular tool during specific times of the day or for certain tasks in order to receive FAPE, then the technology needs to be available for the student and somehow listed in the IEP, but you probably won't get very specific answers about general devices and how they are to be listed in an IEP. Only that if a student needs a device or an accommodation, it should be there so that other people who weren't at that IEP meeting know what is intended, and we have a record of what is intended. Last time we also had a lot of questions about domains and timelines, and that's a place where, as a out-of-state consultant, I really don't have enough expertise to answer those questions. So Amy has volunteered to take these on.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Gail. So from what I understand from a lot of the conversations that I have had with folks in developing these documents, and then having attended the last webinar, that some of the questions that are being asked, while are coming from a lens of assistive technology, sometimes can be addressed on a wider level if we're sort of looking more at big picture, sort of special education processes and ideas to help clarify how AT fits in that process. So one of those things that ended up causing a lot of confusion and a lot of very passionate discussions was the use of the word domain. And I found in my conversations that it can be a little confusing because sometimes folks will use the term domain to have different meanings. And so I just wanted to kind of lay this out there so we can be clear what we're addressing in the documents. So domain typically refers to the areas in which a multidisciplinary team would like to or will consider collecting evaluation data for a certain student. So when you're sitting down, whether it's the first time, that initial evaluation, or it's that 3-year period when that reevaluation comes up, the team will sit down and look at all of the domain areas, such as cognitive, academic, speech and communication, health, social emotional. And the team then decides or ponders and thinks about what areas do we need more information in regard to the student, what areas do we not need more information. And once the team is sort of prepared with the data and what data they do and don't have, the team would sit down at a domain meeting, or sometimes folks call it a meeting, it's just a consent for evaluation meeting. And that meeting sitting at the table is the team as well as the parent or guardian. And at the end of that domain meeting, you most likely will be receiving consent from a parent or guardian to complete evaluations in the domain areas that you identified. When we say the term opening a domain, that means we've decided we need more information in a certain area. We're opening up that domain. We're asking for consent to evaluate in that domain. So one thing that is important to remember is that assistive technology is not its own domain. Doing a full assistive technology evaluation, and in the FAQ document and in the guidance document, we address what it means between assessment versus evaluation. When we're talking about AT evaluation, we're talking about more of that big official total evaluation that the team needs to go outside of the district or outside of the cooperative to a independent contractor or contract with the district cooperative, and bringing someone in from the outside to create to do this large evaluation because the team itself doesn't quite have the expertise or the skills to complete that. So when the team says, oh, we'd like to bring someone in to do an AT evaluation, when we're looking at these domains to get consent for that evaluation, the team may justify in any domain where the team wants to know, will AT be supportive? So one common example is an area of speech and communication. If we're saying we have a child who is a nonverbal communicator, we want more information about how we can help this child learn some communication skills, find that path of least resistance for communication. We'd like to do an AT eval. So we're going to put in the domain AT evaluation under speech, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So just keep in mind, again, that domain has a couple different meanings. So again, those areas, the actual meeting, when you're physically sitting at the table, we call that a domain meeting. And opening a domain is when you decide that you do need evaluation in a certain area. Now, once you receive that consent for evaluation, that kicks off that famed 60-day timeline. And due to a question that we had last time, I did want to clarify that that 60-day timeline refers to 60 school days. 60 school days, okay? When you're getting consent for an evaluation, consent for an evaluation needs to come from a parent or guardian, and that needs to happen through a typical consent for evaluation / domain meeting where you open a domain, talk with the team, talk with the parent, get consent to evaluate. There's some flexibility on that. Let's say you already had a domain last week, and oh boy, we're realizing we forgot to put the AT evaluation in there. Can we call the parent and have them give us consent for that additional evaluation? Yes, but that all needs to be documented in that domain paperwork. So if a parent is just writing a letter to say, I give consent for AT eval, go ahead and start it, the team would still have to go back and go through the typical channels and processes to make sure everything is documented. And then I just wanted to touch on the concept of trialing AT devices during the evaluation process. So there's nothing stopping the team from trialing any kind of assistive technology while that child is, quote, under evaluation, or, quote, while those domains are open. Some may consider, as part of the evaluation, part of assessment is collecting data on what AT a student is responding to during that 60-day evaluation period. Go ahead and try it, see what happens, take the data. You're definitely able to do that. It might be easier to trial devices that are lower tech than higher tech, but it absolutely does happen that even those high tech AAC devices are absolutely trialed during the evaluation process. So there's nothing stopping you from attempting to investigate what would be the best way to offer a child FAPE in the area of assistive technology. So could you move on to the next slide, Gail? Thank you. All right, so just to quickly touch on, and there were a couple questions about the general timeline. Again, when you come from a lens of AT, sometimes it's hard to generalize the area of AT because it is so different, and then plug it into the typical processes. So just to review, you can see on your screen a typical flow chart of what the typical evaluation / IEP development timeline is like. And you can find information about that timeline at the link that you see on your screen. So again, I just want to point out that if there's a referral for an evaluation, whether that's an initial 3-year reevaluation, there's a new presenting issue, then the team would have a domain meeting to get that consent to evaluate. Then the 60 school days, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a general look, and hopefully we can keep some of these general concepts in mind while we're thinking about where AT fits in. I believe we got one more slide for me. Okay, so this is just an example of, quote, you're opening a domain. And this is an example from one of the template IEP documents that's available on the ISBE webpage. It is just an example. Please do not use this text as a copy and paste into a student's IEP document. But basically what it would look like in the domain paperwork when you're filling it out on whatever program that your district or cooperative uses, typically will look something like this. We're looking at the domain area of communication status, okay? The next box usually says relevant. Whether or not you are collecting evaluation data on the student, if communication status is something that is part of the student's story, part of the student's needs, it's always going to be relevant. Yes. The existing information about the child. We know that this student is nonverbal. The student uses static pictures on a core board, but appears to grow frustrated with the limitations of those static 2D visual options. So the team really would love to get some additional evaluation data, and this is how they want to do it. They're going to describe it in this box. Yes, more data is needed to determine if assistive technology, or AAC, will benefit the student in the educational environment by increasing access to communication options. So that's where you would record, yep, we're doing this evaluation. This is exactly what we're going to do. The last box, this is where you're going to put what you're planning to do. That big assistive technology evaluation will go under sources from which the data will be obtained. And you write in assistive technology evaluation. So kind of have to think about separating some of these concepts out. Okay, so is the additional evaluation data needed? Yes, and here's why. How are you going to get that data? AT evaluation. Now, if you had an AT specialist on your team, that might not be necessary. The sources from which the data will be obtained might be evaluation completed by district assistive technology specialist. Maybe they'll put in something like checklists or trials or what have you, whatever that person finds necessary. But again, that's just sort of specifying how you're getting that data. And you would use that same line of thinking if you switched out communication status for functional, the functional domain area. You know, what do we know about this child? Maybe this child has some fine motor challenges and might need some assistive technology to help with writing or with keyboarding or what have you. You would say, yes, here's the data we know about this child's functioning. Yes, we do want more information if assistive technology will help this child function in the classroom with respect to fine motor skills. Sources from which the data will be obtained, assistive technology evaluation. So again, this is just demonstrating how you get that assistive technology evaluation listed on that domain, because there isn't an AT specific domain. It sort of just is an option to support. And you can put that evaluation in several domain areas if you find it pertinent. So again, just another example of how that fits into that whole process. And I think I am set. And I'm going to put I'm pretty sure my email address is at the end of this somewhere. I'm going to put my email address in the chat as well so that you can email me directly if you have any more questions. The Google document is going to be a really good way to get those questions answered. But if there's something that I can help with, I'm happy to do that. So I think I'm all good, Gail.
Amy?
Thank you.
We do have a question that is pertaining to you.
Okay.
So I'm trying to figure out one of the words, but I'm going to try to get context cues to figure it out. It is
Sure.
difficult to use speech and communication as an example because there are skilled medical professionals at each district to do these evals or assessment. What the group would like to know is when a child with a current IEP may benefit from AT for reading, who does that? Is an evaluation needed? No one in the district can do it, or assessment processes within the specialized instruction, not consent for eval.
So that's a great question. And this is actually a topic that we talked about last time. And I think this is specifically addressed in the FAQ as well, in thinking about the difference between assessment and evaluation.
Okay.
We kind of want to think about assessment as the day-to-day data collection. You've got someone on your team who sees this child regularly, collects this assessment data, and is able to make some AT decisions from there. I kind of think about the assistive technology evaluation as sort of like a big kahuna, like a bigger evaluation that needs to be completed by someone outside of your organization. So if you're bringing someone in from an independent contractor, and you're bringing that person into the team to complete that, you would need consent. Kind of a rule of thumb that I sometimes go on is that if this is an evaluation, or if you need data that is sort of extraneous to what any other student would get, or like if you have a screening, let's say vision and hearing screening, right? You don't exactly, or that example, social emotional screening, you might not need a consent for because it's a screening. Everybody gets it. But if you are singling out a child, you're having a specific practitioner pulling this child and looking at something extremely specific, extremely specialized, it's safer to have that consent documented in the domain. And really that evaluation piece, it's up to the district or the cooperative or the team or what have you to decide how that's going to be done. If you have someone already who is well versed in the data and is a professional in the area that you are wanting more information on, then by all means, go ahead and have that person be a part of it. We're thinking more, and Gail, I think you can touch on this as well, we're thinking more that if you need to be pulling someone in from outside of your organization, that would be considered that sort of larger AT evaluation that you would need consent for.
Amy, the gray area that I think often confuses people, and I think you've done a wonderful job of clarifying for the participants what it means to open a domain. The gray area is sometimes a child may have been receiving specially designed instruction for some time before assistive technology is considered. And those are actually often the kids with more academically based disabilities like reading or writing. And so that's one of the questions. And I think part of your answer for me was very helpful. Many districts have assistive technology teams and assistive technology specialists on staff, but they may not know, for instance, a fourth grader who may need to use accessible educational materials or something like that. So I think that's one of the places where the questions often arise is if you're pulling an HE specialist from the district into an already existing IEP meeting, is that evaluation or assessment?
Yeah, I can see why that would be a difficult concept to sort of parse out, but I want to think about this for a second outside of the realm of AT. Let's think you have a student who has an IEP. You're at the IEP table and you're saying, wow, I think this child has some behavioral, social, emotional concerns. I think this student needs social work. You might have a social worker on your team who, based on their experience and spending time with this kid, would say, yeah, I probably would qualify that student for services. You cannot just decide right at that moment to just add the services. You still need the consent to evaluate. You still need to have the data to back up your decision. That still needs to be documented. So we can't just start willy-nilly throwing services and things at students just because they already have an IEP. We still have to use the data. We have to justify the decisions and really make sure that this is really the best support, because maybe even you came to the table and thought you knew what was best for this student, but maybe through the evaluation process you find out like, oh, actually in the same vein, but maybe something different. So really, if there's any question on the team's really not sure, we can't really make a super informed decision. We really need to do a full evaluation. Consent will need to be obtained, and it would need to fit into a domain area. Now, if you're doing something smaller, like if a student needs like a seat cushion or a pencil grip, those are the kinds of things that maybe your team would be able to determine without an evaluation that a student might need. And in that case, you're documenting in the accommodations area that this student benefits from the use of pencil grip. Where the evaluations come in is where things start to get a lot more complicated, when you're using really high-tech devices, when you're having to now look into what kind of brailler will a student need, what kind of durable medical equipment does this child need to participate in school. So really, if you feel very confident that your team can add this as an accommodation, this is going to work, awesome, go for it. But if this is something your team is not well versed in, the person who's coming in does not know this child, it's better to receive consent.
Okay. And I want to just clarify, it could be, it often can be somebody from an outside agency, but it also could be somebody who's not normally providing services to the child, who's a district employee.
Sure.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the question box. Jen, are there any that we should be addressing?
We have none thus far.
Okay, great. Well, let's go on to the next part of our presentation. You may remember that I said last time we had so many good questions and so much good discussion that we didn't have time to get through the entire frequently asked questions document. So you will see here that we did get through sections A, B, and C, definitions, consideration, and evaluation, and assessment. But we had some questions during those conversations that we couldn't give you direct answers to, so we went back to ISBE and we talked to Amy, and we've added those into this webinar. So let's look at those questions before we move on to the rest of the FAQ document. One of the questions that came up last time was, who can suggest AT in an IEP? And you'll see here that the response to that question is anybody can contribute information to help the IEP team's work and may suggest AT as an option. So especially since AT must be considered by the team during every annual IEP meeting and might be considered at other times, if someone on the team believes that a student may need it, they can raise that issue. So hopefully that's a good, clear, solid answer. I love questions that have really good, clear, solid answers. And here's a couple more that came from that consideration section last time. Would you consider a parent request for an AT evaluation in an initial evaluation prior to special education eligibility? So this answer has a couple parts. One is, you'll remember that Amy said that AT is not its own domain. So an AT evaluation would have to be related to one of the domains you're looking at in an initial eligibility statement. But also AT evaluation can be included in an initial evaluation when the team opens a domain and somebody thinks that AT might be one of the evaluation activities that are needed. So AT can also be completed after initial eligibility is established. So it could be part of an initial eligibility, it could be part of a domain evaluation set of activities, or it could be done after initial eligibility is established. Another similar question about consideration. If a parent acquires an AT device for their child and asks for it to be included in the student's educational program, what actions should be taken? And you'll see here that in this situation, the IEP team should come back to the parent and say, okay, you've asked for this specific thing. What data and information do you have that this is a thing that should be considered by the IEP team as we write this year's IEP? So it's perfectly fine to come back to parents and say, how did you decide on this solution? And many of you will know parents who do this kind of thing pretty well. So you may be able to have some good conversations about how did you decide on this as an AT solution. The IEP team, which always includes the parent, should consider that parent's information in addition to any other data assembled by the IEP team. And then based on that consideration, the team makes a decision about the student's need for AT in the educational program. some of the kinds of examples that we've seen for this type of situation, we've had parents buy Apple Watches for their kids to help with executive function, to help with scheduling, to help with all kinds of things. But then come to school and say, we got him an Apple Watch for Christmas. Now we want it in his IEP. And the team really has to go back and say, well, okay, how would a student use this Apple Watch to accomplish the goals set out in the IEP? Would this be a benefit in providing FAPE in the least restrictive environment? So just as with other kinds of high-tech complicated devices, for instance, an eye gaze system for a student with a severe physical disability, the team needs to consider all the data and hopefully trial period data that goes with that device in terms of relating it to an educational program. So that's a response to, again, to a question we got last time. Feel free, if you need further clarification, to type that into the chat box. We do have some other questions from last time, but we've inserted them into the specific sections in the frequently asked questions guide. So I'm going to move to section D in the frequently asked questions guide. And what we've been doing is pointing out to you that these are the questions in that part of the guide. And this actually, I believe, yeah, no, these are the 5 questions in the frequently asked questions guide. Again, we had many questions in this area, documentation of the need for assistive technology in the IEP. So we're going to move forward to some of those questions for last time and hope that you have, if you have additional questions, we'll be able to answer them now, or you can type them into that Google Doc that we mentioned earlier. One of the very good, thoughtful questions I thought from last time was, if a student has assistive technology, does there need to be a goal associated with it? And here's the response that we developed from that question, and also a reference to information that's in the big document, the actual Illinois AT guide. So AT is provided for students to allow them to benefit from a free and appropriate public education and reach curricular goals. AT can be listed as accommodations or supplementary aids and services that allows a child to participate in the general education curriculum. And it's particularly important that as we talk about supplementary aids and services, we recognize that the definition of supplementary aids and services is involved in allowing the child to participate in curriculum and general education activities. So you can go to page 6 in the guide to get more information about that. Each of these items, special education related services and supplementary aids and services, is further defined in the guide itself and in IDEA. Also from last time, if a previous school provided a specific assistive technology and the child moved from another district, should you provide AT for the student despite it not being necessary in the school? And this is one where I had to go to Amy and to the ISBE website. So here's a response to that question. The Illinois Administrative Code indicates that FAPE must be provided immediately upon receiving the student's IEP from the previous district. The new team can decide to adopt the IEP as they got it from the previous district, or to make changes. But if the team wants to make changes, they have 10 days after the child's enrollment to provide the parent with written notice. And while the new IEP is under development, the district shall implement services comparable to those described in the IEP from the former district. So this is another example of where we have to take a step back, see what the guidance and the rules are for all services in general, because this is a very common thing that a student would move from one district to another, but not so common or not as common that the student would come with assistive technology written on their IEP, especially if the team may not believe that it's necessary in the new situation. You can adopt the IEP as written, or you can make changes. And if you're going to make changes, you have 10 days to notify the parent of how you're going to proceed. So that was another really good question. This is one that I think is not in the current frequently asked questions document and probably needs to be added because it is so specific and so specific to the state of Illinois and how you do things. One more question that's come up a number of times, number of different conversations, is about the cultural and linguistic accommodation section of your IEP form. So the question is, what guidance can you share regarding completing the cultural and linguistic accommodation section of the IEP for students who use AAC? For students using a speech generating device, we can check the corresponding box, but if students are using other forms of AAC, like a manual communication board or a PEC system or a pod system that's not electronic, should that be indicated under other? So this person said, what guidance can you share for completing the 2 subsequent boxes in these instances? And again, we went back to ISBE, and these are the exact words we got as we checked on this question. So the team would check other and then use the box provided in that section to expand on the student's mode of communication. Subsequent boxes regarding communication opportunities and accessibilities will depend on the individual student and how the team is planning to approach social interactions, instruction, extracurriculars, etc., given that the child's mode of communication is some form of augmented system. So again, a question that was a very good question and very specific to the way you do things in your state. So if you have additional questions about that, feel free to insert them either in the question box here or in the Google Doc for next time. The next section in the frequently asked questions document is provision of assistive technology. The questions are based around what is the responsibility of the school district regarding assistive technology, who's required to provide it, who does it belong to if the AT is purchased for a specific child, and whose responsibility is it to maintain AT devices? What if the device belongs to the child? Now you will see answers to all these questions in the frequently asked questions document, but we also had a question in this section that I wanted to share with you from last time, which is what happens if a student requires a high-tech device, but we are told there are no funds to do so. I thought I knew the answer to this question last time when it came up, but I wanted to check with ISBE and make sure I wasn't going to say anything real strongly if it wasn't true. But the answer is, if an IEP team determines that a student needs AT and includes that AT in the IEP, lack of funds is not an acceptable reason for denial of the service. So never is it acceptable to say, oh, we can't do that for this kid because it costs too much money. Now you may consider other options, and on page 31 of the guide, here is a quote which says, with only one exception, cost should not be a factor when considering potential AT tool or system. The purpose of AT is to provide FAQs. However, there is wisdom in considering low-tech AT tools and systems before high-tech AT tools and systems because they tend to be easier to use, to maintain, and to replace than high-tech counterparts. As long as they provide the same benefit, it's okay to consider different options. The only time cost can be a factor in an AT consideration is when 2 equally beneficial AT tools or systems are being considered, and both options provide equivalent compensatory benefit, but one costs more than the other. So hopefully that's a clear enough answer, and it actually applies to many other services too. But what we need to look at first is benefit. So there's the cost question. We have another question about funding, which is, can a school seek other sources of funding to provide AT devices and services that are part of a student's IEP? And the response is, schools may investigate other funding sources for purchasing AT, including private funding and loan programs through nonprofit disability associations. They can consider service organizations and any funding source that provides things for individual students can be considered. Schools may also choose to lease AT as well. It's important to note, however, that the devices and services required in the IEP cannot be delayed while the school tries to find alternative funding sources. So while you might say, well, we're going to look to our Medicaid service providers or insurance or the Lions Sight and Hearing Fund, any of those things, we're going to look for that. You still have to provide the assistive technology as soon as it is included in the child's IEP. Then you can go looking for other funding sources. And that, again, we cited here, page 34 in the guide is where you will find that information and a little bit more about that topic. Section E of the frequently asked questions document is about the provision of assistive technology. Actually, we're continuing about section E. And we had questions from last time again, and the one in this section is about section 504. So can students with section 504 plans also have AT? The difference between kids who have IEPs and the kids who have section 504 plans is that section 504 implies that the student does not need specially designed instruction, but may need accommodations and modifications. So yes, schools can provide assistive technology as an accommodation to a student on a section 504 plan in order to make sure that they have equal opportunity to participate in required school activities and to have access to the curriculum. There is wording that further expands this on page 14 of the guide, and also there's a reference here to the place where you can get more information at the federal level. One of the things that I think is important to know is that the funding for devices for students who have section 504 plans is not funding that comes from your IDEA dollars. And that's one of the things that sometimes kind of gets in the way. If your district doesn't have a procedure for deciding how to provide assistive technology for students on 504 plans, that can be a little bit difficult. Last section in the, not next to the last section in the FAQ, and that is about progress monitoring. So the questions are, once AT is included in the child's educational program, what action should we take to make sure that AT is successful? The second question here is, what are the potential outcomes of progress monitoring for AT use? The actions are the same kinds of actions. I don't have a slide for this one because the answers to these questions are in the FAQ document. And basically what the FAQ document says is you need to do the same kind of progress monitoring for the use of assistive technology that you do for any other part of the child's domain where you have identified a need for specially designed instruction and for assistive technology. In terms of the outcomes of progress monitoring, you may find that the assistive technology is working well and it's increased the child's ability to make progress in their educational programs. You may find that it's not working well at all, and you may want to go back to a further AT assessment or further AT evaluation. Or you may find that the assistive technology really wasn't the right solution for this particular student, even though you did the best assessment and the best evaluation you could possibly think of. So basically, the progress monitoring questions are very much the same as any other answer about progress monitoring in any other area. Okay, the final section is about transition from school to community. And these are the questions that are in the frequently asked questions document. The one I wanted to highlight because it's so critical for transition teams as they plan for a child to move on to adult services and community environments is when a student is 22 and no longer a student of the district, who provides the AT services in the adult world? If it is planned for in a transition plan, how is the cost for such services handled? And again, I think this is a critical feature of any transition plan. And one of the things people don't actually recognize is that in adult services, whether your services are developmental disability services or transition services or whatever, those services need to be requested by the individual or their guardian when they turn 22 and leave the school system. So there's no automatic provision of assistive technology, just like there is no automatic provision of any other kind of transition services. So that's the end of our frequently asked questions document. While you type your questions into the Google Doc or into the question box here, I want to remind you that our next webinar, based on your questions, will happen on May 3rd, same time, same place, May 3rd, 2021, from 3:30 to 4:30 Central Time. And we want to invite you to type your questions into one of those places, the chat box or the Google document. And here's the information about how to get in touch with me and Amy Deegan and Peggy Childs at Infinitec if you have big picture questions that you want to talk to her about. Jen, I don't know if there's anything else in the questions box or anything else we should be addressing now, but our timing was pretty good today.
It was perfect. I am not seeing questions, but we'll give everyone a few minutes to type. So while we're waiting, I just wanted to thank Gail and Amy for their endless time on this and their willingness to provide additional webinars to make sure that we have all the questions met from all of our participants. So we do have something coming in. Someone saying thank you, very informative.
Jen, I did want to go back really quick. I'm sorry to take up the time, but someone in the question that was previously, this is Amy, by the way, the question that was previously brought up was that, you know, when we're thinking about the evaluation questions and the domain and what have you, we don't want to just focus on AAC. And then I understand that it gets frustrating, you know, when we try to pigeonhole everything into thinking about AAC. But if we're trying to get folks, you know, I understand this person was saying, I'm trying to get teachers and districts to understand that it's not only AAC, and that's very true. In my personal experience, when it comes to having to do some of those big kahuna evaluations, it does end up being those super high-tech options like AAC, but AT can be anything. AT can be chewing gum. AT can be anything. So if your teams are finding that you have some of these things that you want to try out, you don't necessarily think you need a giant evaluation. We just want to trial. We want to see. We're going to do some in-class assessment of a child's use of speech to text or a screen reader or the use of a slant board. If you feel confident that you can collect that data and really support the student with that, then go for it. If you don't feel confident, then do start that evaluation process. But again, I'm not trying to force anybody to have to do a full evaluation for a pencil grip. So I don't think that's necessary. But I just want to add that so there's no confusion or panic. So thank you.
Well, and Amy, I want to emphasize that one of the things I've really appreciated in this work I've been able to do with ISBE is that you've really made the distinction between doing an assessment if you have the tools and the information that you need in order to try things with a student that you already have eligibility for, and doing an evaluation when there's new information that's needed that's just really not available. But the focus on the IEP team needs to have enough information to make a good, clear decision about assistive technology is what I hope is the takeaway from this is, do we have enough information to make a good decision?
Yes, I would agree. And it does get a little difficult because we recognize AT is not exactly a related service. It doesn't have its own place to live in the IEP, so we have to be a little creative. Just think critically about the data that you're looking for, and if you might need consent and conferring with the parent to kind of start that journey. So
the wonderful part of AT doesn't have its own place is that it fits every place.
yes,
For some kids. So that's coming from an AT specialist perspective.
exactly. Well, thank you, Gail.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for being here, Amy. It was very helpful.
Very helpful to have the ISB perspective. Thanks again for our presenters for your time and sharing of information, and also all of you folks attending online. So this concludes today's webinar. Thanks, everyone. I hope everyone has a great, safe evening, and take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Gail. Bye, Amy. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.